All right, welcome everyone. My name is Andy Chambers. I am a games designer and writer of ridiculously long tenure at this point. I started off in Games Workshop in 1990, and I worked on Warhammer 40,000, the Epic games, Battlefleet Gothic, Gorka Morka, Necromunda, other things I'm probably forgetting about now. And a lot of White Dwarf articles, which is what a lot of people know me for. I used to do battle reports with Jervis Johnson in White Dwarf back in the day, in which he would perennially lose to me. Not because he's a worse gamer, but just because he couldn't focus during battle reports. And I did that for 14 years, worked at Games Workshop. Eventually we parted company. I went and worked at Blizzard Entertainment over in California for 4 years. I worked on StarCraft 2 while I was there, so I got a big slice of the digital world for a while, which had always fascinated me because I've been solidly locked into tabletop gaming for the previous 14 years. But it didn't work out for me. Actually, my kind of love, sad to say, is tabletop games. So eventually I made my way back here. I spent another couple of years after that freelancing in America, and then I moved back to the UK. And landed up here to find that Warlord Games has sprung up like some unholy mushroom in my absence, and was full of people that I used to work with at Games Workshop, including Paul Sawyer and John Stallard and so on. So I got together with them. They were starting to push bolt action at the time, and they asked me to do Alessio, actually, Cavatori. It was somebody else I'd worked with at Games Workshop. It's all nepotism at the end of the day. Asked me to do Armies of the Soviet Union for bolt action, which I did with a great deal of pleasure because it's always been a passion subject of mine. And I did a few more things. I did Empires in Flames, and Ostfront as well for bolt action. But also over the last few years, as people just keep coming in. Do I have to tell you to turn your cell phone off as well? No. Oh, we're not done. Keep coming, keep coming. So, and over the last few years, I've been working on primarily Blood Red Skies, which is a World War II fighter combat game of my own design, that we'll talk a lot more about over the course of the time I have you for. And the 2000 AD games. Thank you. You're an absolute star.
Tea bag there in case you want to dip it back in.
You're a lovely man. This man, by the way, is just gone and got me a cup of tea just because I asked him to. So I think a big round of applause for that. Thank you. I don't care. The thing is that I have the much needed caffeine I need to continue my day. So the 2000 AD games, of which I did the first one with Gavin Thorpe. There's a funny story about that. A guy I used to work with at Games Workshop. And that was Strontium Dog. And then I did Shidred with Roger Gerish, who's here as well. And the most recent one that's come out is Slain, the Barbarian miniatures game. Yeah, that can. Which we've just come out with, and we've kind of got some more in the works on the 2000 AD games. That's been a huge passion project for me because I kind of grew up reading 2000 AD comics. I literally remember like being in the schoolyard reading 2000 AD. ABC Warriors, Deadlock specifically. So to actually get to make tabletop games about that has been great. Really fun. So I am here. I have no idea what you've been told to bring you into this room right now, but you have me to ask questions of and generally irritate for the next however much time until that battery runs out on that camera. So go for it. Are there any questions? Did anybody get the whole story, didn't hear any of that needs to hear it again? Or do you have any questions? Just jump in. Ask me things. I am here for you. Gentleman right on the end there in the brown jacket, sir.
Top tip for one thing that you would advise to any game designer, what would you tell them before they jump in? Or when they're already partway through something, and what to ask Andy Chambers this question? Aspiring
games designers. I do run across some of these, as you might imagine. I think my top tip is, like, first of all, ask yourself why you're doing it. What are you doing it for? Are you doing it to become famous and make money? Because you won't get famous and make money doing games design. You genuinely won't. Are you doing it because you want to spread joy, bring joy into people's lives, have fun, show other people to have fun, and kind of share your love of gaming? good idea. Do games design in that case. You will be rewarded through it because it is a very rewarding career, and I can call it a career at this point because it's a bit like Inigo Montoya. I've more pursued than studied, but I've spent 30 years now making games. I saw something nice actually by Trish Carden recently. She's a miniatures designer at Games Workshop, and she said, I've had a great career because I just got to let people have fun. It brought people joy. And that's what you get out of games design. Starting out these days is both much easier and much harder than it was when I started out. Back in 1990, I had to literally like type up an article, submit it through snail mail to Games Workshop, and then read it and sort of say, oh, that's sort of interesting, coming in. Now we can all reach each other all the time. So there are all kinds of different ways that you can get your ideas out there into the world and start building up your skills, building up a sort of base of people that know you as well. But at the same time, everybody else is doing it too, so it's a lot harder to make an impact. But actually, gaming's massively expanded over the course of my career. There are so many different people making games, and the knowledge of how to do it is so widespread out there that if you want it, you can find it. I don't have an awful lot of advice in the very modern sense, though, about how to do that. People come to my attention because they've established blogs, they've run communities, they've got the community sort of like fired up in a particular direction. That kind of community action is great and very necessary. It's not necessarily games design per se, but that's a different school as well. You have to do a bit of commercial games design at some point, but how you get in on that. Some of the larger companies do actively seek submissions. Ravensburger, for example, is a board game company in the States, and they will take submissions from absolutely anybody. But obviously they have a lot of people giving them submissions as well. So how you build up and branch out, I think, start small with the people you know, write for the people you know, start to expand that base. Okay, we'll take another question.
I had a question about when you calibrate the rules for a game. I always think it's a great achievement when you calibrate the rules and the stats for the models, so that it's a competitive and interesting game for both people who are very novices and people who are very expert. I wanted to ask you how you do that, how you make sure that. It's a trick. One of the biggest things that you learn over designing a lot of games is to, one, don't hand people bad choices. Don't give them things that are ineffective or less effective. Don't give them sets of rules that they might sort of like trip themselves up on. And the other thing is like try not to have too many surprises, because that's the way that a veteran player smacks a novice, is that it's something, oh, I didn't know that about the system. And that's usually a bad experience as well. It's a negative experience. So you try and avoid those circumstances. So mechanics should generally be quite open, quite obvious, and they should kind of flow the way you think they would, even without knowing the game itself. It's like, okay, that guy that's standing behind a rock is harder to hit than that guy that's standing in the open. It's just logic, okay? As many things as you can do like that, little things where it just has a logical flow to it, and you actually start getting away from the rules. And always writing rules is about trying to create a sort of consensual reality between you and the other player playing the game, what the rules say, because you're operating in imagination. So as long as you can try and make it straightforward enough that everybody's got the same idea of what's going on and what's liable to occur, then that generally makes it a lot easier to get between the veteran and the novice player and give them a nice even fight. Because while the veteran can tie himself up in knots with like knowing what the actual maths result will be from X, Y, Z and using this on that, the relative novice is freed from all those burdens. He just has the impressions he's got. And if you've managed to do that thing of like creating a consensual reality that makes sense to both sides, he's going to be as right as the veteran is about the choices he's making. In some ways, because he doesn't have the burden of knowing too much about the game, he may be more righter. And the other thing that you always get with tabletop games is, assuming you use dice are just the devil, the absolute devil. You can make them more the devil and less the devil in your games, but they will always produce unexpected results. People like to talk about probability. like it's some golden rule of like, if I roll these 6 dice, there's a 50% chance I will get at least. Probabilities, it's fake, it's not true. Take it from a guy who's designed games with dice for 30 years. Every dice roll is an individual dice roll. It's just more or less likely to happen, but the fact you've done 6 of these dice rolls in a row doesn't mean the 6th one's any more likely to happen than the first one is. Each of them is individual. And if you can try and keep that in mind, that the dice they don't care what they just rolled, is what I'm trying to say. They just care what they're rolling right now. So the sort of like the avalanche effect you can get from luck, it can go both ways, but it can switch round partway through a game as well, and that's always a great defense for the novice player of just getting lucky on the dice, or the veteran player getting unlucky on the dice. The irony of all this is, to the veteran player, it'll always feel like luck's against him because he knows the probabilities, and he's like, this should work. To the novice, again, they're not burdened by that kind of responsibility of mind going on. So, again, I guess what I'm saying is just make sure that the dice are important enough. You don't want them to completely dominate your game, but make sure that they're important enough that luck does have a factor to play. You can kind of like, you can pile up the odds in your favour, but it's not going to make it happen automatically. Or if you want that part of your game to work like that, there are things that just happen automatically, you know. Anyway, getting into highfalutin stuff now.
It sounds like that's where our beginner's luck comes from then.
Yes, absolutely. A beginner's luck is a real thing. Lady at the back.
When you're writing for something like in the 2000 AD universe, which has got this deliberately over-the-top bonkers vibe to it, intentionally so, how do you translate that feel into game mechanics? To something like Dog, which I've not played, but I'm assuming is aiming for a more realistic.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. It's one that we obviously talked about a lot at the start of doing Strontium Dog the first time out, and you can make your games more and less swingy, more and less wacky by various techniques. One of the ones that I knew from doing 2nd edition 40k, which was a very wacky, very superhero kind of comic book sort of a game, was special powers and special abilities you can put in there. When it came to the 2000 AD games, there's a fact with the comic strips where you'll have a character, he'll be struggling with some particular problem, and he'll whip out a piece of technology. Number 4 cartridge is the Strontium Dog one, which is some explosive charge that he fires out with a variable charge blaster that suddenly detonates whatever spaceship is strafing them at the time or what have you. Or, if it's close combat, electro-nucs. He whips out the electro-nucs, and whatever monstrosity, mutant, alien, doesn't matter, smacks them with the electro-nucs, down they go. So you kind of look at those comic book techniques and say, how does that work in a game? Well, in a game, you can give out gear. Now, you don't want it to be sort of like you buy this off an army list, so you put it on cards, you shuffle up the cards, you deal out the cards at random. Now, do you have the electro-nucs, or does the bad guy have the electro-nucs? Who knows? But I've got this other thing, Time Bomb. That's another great favourite, the Strontium Dog game. Oh no, I can't possibly, it's impossible to shoot this thing for some reason. Oh well, Time Bomb. What a Time Bomb does, it produces a little stasis bubble which freezes the subject in time until the planet has moved on. And then when the stasis bubble goes, they die in the expanse of space. Even if they're robots, weirdly enough. But Time Bomb, so that's another, and that was the thing that reminded me directly. We used to have something in 2nd edition 40k called the Vortex Grenade, which would produce this spinning vortex which just annihilated anything that was there. No dice roll, just gone. And while that's, from a games design sense, that's just a dreadful thing. It's like dropping anvils on people's heads. But it does produce stories. You never forget the first time when somebody managed to drop a vortex grenade on your transport full of assault marines or what have you. So having that sort of facility to happen in the game is a good thing. I say you just don't let people buy it. You have it as random chance. You have some counters for it as well. Obviously, there's another card that counters the Time Bomb or something like that. So that's how you get some of that really high-end wackiness that you see in the comics out of there. The other thing that we did with Strontium Dog and all the 2000 AD games is had an activation system which it kind of learns off bolt action to a certain extent, in that it's like a chips in a bag system. But what we said for the 2018 games is that the real powerful characters, the main characters, the named characters, your Johnny Alphas, Judge Dredds of this world, they get special chips when theirs are pulled out of the bag. Their special chips lets them put their chip back into the bag once they've done something. So you have a character who's capable of, at that point, potentially dealing with lots of lesser characters at the same time, because they can get successive goes and keep doing, or just achieve a hell of a lot over the course of a single activation. So they're not actually subject to the same rules as normal pieces. They have superpowers just because they are main characters with a cool rating of 4 or 5, so they get star chips in that particular game. So that's the other leg of it, of what we did there. The third thing really that works in favour of producing that sort of game with the 2008 games is the model count is very, very low. As little as 3 or 4 on a side, 2 or 3 on a side even. So it's a lot more skirmishy. That makes things a lot more swingy, obviously, because there's less events happening, less dice rolls being made. So the dice rolls take on a lot more import, and it comes back to what I was telling this gentleman before about luck comes into it. So anything can happen in the next half hour. And that's fine for those games because that's the expectation that's been set. That's the consensual reality we're trying to make. People have read 2000 AD, even if they haven't, and they pick up the games, we always say, go buy some graphic novels, read 2000 AD, because that's by far the best source material when it comes to those games. And that sets your expectation that these sort of events, the time bomb coming out, the Electro Nux, the number 4 cartridge, are things that happen in those games. It's not like playing a Napoleonic game or even an air combat game where, reality has a set of parameters that need to be respected. So that's one of the things that makes them fun, if I'm honest, as well, because they are designed to be fun games, wacky. Balance isn't too much of a concern in them, and they're not really competitive games in that sort of a sense. They're far more sort of like narrative-driven, event-driven games. You, sir, check shirt.
How much are you looking forward to doing Rogue Trooper, assuming it's going to happen? Have you played any of the Jim Webster games?
Which are the Jim Webster games?
He's an author and roleplay and wargame about that he self-publishes stuff. Something in Civil Disorder is one of his big ones. It's sort of covers sort of Abyssinian element to end of World War II-ish sort of thing.
Oh, okay. I'm not aware of. What's the name again?
Jim Webster.
Jim Webster. Well, the name does kind of vaguely ring a bell, but no, I've not followed any of those.
He wrote a load of stuff like Hell by, so it's like Hell by Daylight, Hell by Starlight.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. Wow, interesting. You'd recommend him, would you, Jim Webster?
Yeah. He's the wargame club I go to, so.
Oh, I see. You've got a bit of a local bias on that then. So out of 2000 AD games, Rogue Trooper is one that we definitely want to do. They've been slightly, I'll use the phrase, delayed because of COVID overall. We had Slain done kind of just before COVID hit. No, actually we had it done about a year before that. And it was already a bit kind of like delayed because Warlord had plenty of things coming down the pipe already. And then it was delayed more because of COVID. So that's kind of set us back on where we're hoping to get to. Rogue Trooper is definitely on there. I am actually Facebook friends with Gordon Rennie, who writes Jaeger at the moment, which is set in the Rogue Trooper universe. And he basically does all the good Rogue Trooper stuff, is the way it works out with Gordon Rennie. So I'm hoping, if and when we get to do Rogue Trooper, I can drag him in to help out a little bit on the colour text and background, because I really like what he's done. I always used to like Rogue Trooper. It went through some very dire phases. It started out well, got really dire for a very long time, and it's gradually been dragging itself out of the mud, in my opinion, through 2000 AD. One of the things we get with the 2000 AD titles is, because they, Judge Dredd or something like that, it ranges over 40 years worth of strips, weekly strips in many cases. So when you come to make a game out of it, you kind of have to stick a pin in the map and say, well, we're kind of doing this bit of Dread, or well, we're doing. It was easy with Strontium Dog because it had a consistent writers and consistent artists all the way through. Actually, no, I said that. They did see some. We just chose to ignore it. We chose to ignore all the stuff that wasn't as queer and waggly. So, and that's what you have to do, basically. You pick your era and kind of maybe mention the other stuff, but maybe just kind of ignore it on the rest. With Slain, we've gone for the Bisley period of Slain, the Horned God period of, there's a specific graphic novel that we use for most of the reference for that. Because when you come to make the miniatures, it's like, well, what does Judge Dredd look like right now? Does he look like he looked in the 1980s? Does he look like he looked in the Judge Dredd movie? Does he look like he looks in the Carl Urban movie? And so on. So you kind of have to pick a thing and stick to it. So when it comes to Rogue Trooper, I'm hoping we can do more modern Rogue Trooper rather than Ford Europa. Oh, God. Yes, and try and avoid all of that. Which is kind of suitable because the stuff Gordon Rennie does, it tends to be more skirmishy, less of a battle game. My initial thought when it first came up, we could do Rogue Trooper, 2000 AD titles being available, was like, 15mm game, marvellous, cast of thousands and all this sort of thing. It'd be like World War One, but with Norths and Southers, which would be a lot of fun to do, but would not sell very well, and I don't know, it wouldn't fit in with the other games that we've been doing for the 2000 AD series either. So, and that's part of the idea, is to use the same mechanics in all of the games. Try not to mess with them as much as possible, rather than write a completely fresh game each time. Which at first was just out of practicality, really. But as we've done more of them, people actually really like that aspect of them. Is like, if you know Strontium Dog, then basically you know Judge Dredd as well. You don't have to learn a new game for it. So that's something I kind of retrospectively went back to Slain, because we changed a fair bit of Slain, because it was very different. It wasn't gunfights anymore, sci-fi gunfights. It was, melee combat between strapping barbarian heroes. So we changed a fair few things. And I actually went back and changed them back to be more like Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog, because of that carryover knowledge was valuable and it was worth preserving. So I tried to make the changes just limited to certain areas. And again, if and when we get to Rogue Trooper, then we'll certainly follow through with that as well. But yeah, I love doing those 2008 games, and I look forward to doing Rogue Trooper when we get there. I hope we will get there. It is not the next thing, though, I can tell you that. You, sir.
Yeah, quick
Very
one.
patient.
Do you read your 2000 AD online, or do you get the magazines?
I get it delivered to my house, yes. I've got a subscription. I've got a physical subscription. I never really liked reading them on a screen, because I got a Kindle version for a lot of the old Judge Dredd case files and stuff like that, which was great, and I caught up with stuff that I've not seen in 40 plus years. But it just wasn't quite the same. And also, if I'm honest, they're really more they're designed for spreads.
Yeah.
You don't see it all the time, but you still get a point where you can open out a comic and you can see that the whole spread's been designed graphically to look like that, and you don't get that on Kindle or something like that when you're scooping around. So yeah, I'm a sucker for physical media.
And so
on that
how
one.
did yourself and Warlord get associated with 2000 AD in the initial? How did it sort of kick off?
That is one you'll have to pitch to Paul. I don't know where it originally.
All right.
Yeah, they basically came to me. They were already talking to them about the license at that point and saying, "Look, we've got the 2000 AD." So I was like, "Oh, really?" Because they've known me forever. So they've known. I mean, honestly, when we were back at Games Workshop, 2000 AD was always a huge influence on us. It was that, along with whatever movies were coming out at the time, was one of our primary reference points. And if you've known 2000 AD down the years, you'll be able to see all sorts of stuff that's in Games Workshop lore these days that originate there, that were just some wacky idea or something that got thrown out there. It was like, pick it up and run with it, sort of a thing. So it's always been hugely influential, and it feels like a great honour to actually do stuff for 2000 AD. So long may it continue, but I say we shall see. Oh, you at the back, sir, with the beard. Yeah, that doesn't narrow the field much here, does it?
Doesn't narrow it down. With games that you've designed where there's something similar that's come before it, like Blood Red Skies, there have been other fighter games, and one of my favourites, Battle Fleet Gothic, there have been space games. Do you like to look at those previous games and like kind of take inspiration? Or do you like to kind of work in a completely different space and make something that's different?
Yeah, I prefer to work in a bubble. I try almost consciously not to look at what other people have done. I mean, you don't get away without knowing a little bit about what a lot of games are about. But yeah, I'm concerned about not aping other people's mechanics, really, at the end of the day. Which is not to say that you can't steal mechanics. People do it all the time. I do it all the time. But I don't know. When I come to a game, and it must be said Blood Red Skies is something of an exception, because that's one that I designed off my own back. But when I come to a game, I like to kind of have an idea in my own mind of where I'm going with it. And I feel like looking what other people have done, you'll see where other people have gone with it, okay, but that's not going to tell you where to go with it in your own mind. Yeah. There may be mechanics you can steal and approaches that are applicable, but the kind of meta game, what are we doing here at this table part of the game, that's for you as the designer to decide primarily and not read from somebody else. So, clearer example. When it came to making Blood Red Skies, I was conscious of the fact that Wings of Glory and Wings of War is out there. It's a game that plays fighter combat with 1/200 scale aircraft. So of course I was aware it's out there and I know it's very popular. But at the same time, Blood Red Skies came from a desire to do an aircraft combat game that wasn't like any other ones that were out there. Because I'd always found them very, very fussy. And my personal experience of like flying online, spent a year flying in the virtual Luftwaffe, was nothing like this sort of like pre-planning, very kind of straight-laced, anal approach that seemed to be embodied by all of the aircraft games that I knew about. It was a very visceral combat sort of style, and it was also a mass combat thing where it wasn't 2 or 3 planes fighting, it was 10 or 12. So that was kind of my aim point. So I kind of felt like trying to read other people's games and how other people would do it would gradually drag me back towards what the current consensus was. And in that particular case, I wanted something that wasn't in the current consensus. I wanted something different. Battlefleet Gothic, kind of similar as well, because there was a way you did spaceship games, and I thought it was ass, and I wanted to do it differently. So I didn't look at the way you did spaceship games. I'd looked at it in the past, you know, like in my teens and stuff like that when I used to play those sort of games. Because I love spaceships, and I love the idea of spaceship gaming, but the practicality of it was always awful. So I tried to write something that wasn't like that, really. So it was kind of consciously kicking against what was there before. And I guess that's become a bit of a habit now. Thank you. It's one of my proudest achievements.
What developments have you got in the pipeline for Blood Red Skies?
Blood Red
considering going into World War I?
World War I is, for Blood Red Skies, it's fraught with difficulties in terms of actually manufacturing the planes, because they're damn biplanes. Now, 3D printing offers a solution to that, but this place doesn't. It's not a 3D printers, so I'm a little bit stymied, really, on that front about World War I. Roger here's trying to tempt me into it with some very nice 3D printed albatrosses and stuff like that. And it would be good, and it would adapt easily, but I don't know. I think for future development of Blood Red Skies, my focus is probably going to be looking at trying to get a version 2. Because we talk about it in the community quite a lot about, we'll fix that in version 2. And even though it's probably years away, it's probably time to start thinking about that. And whether that means the game stays as it is now exactly, and just gets tidied up some more, or whether it actually alters as a game slightly. I guess Blood Red Skies, my hope for it, as I say, was regularly playing with 10 or 12 planes aside, and the sort of starter set 6 actually is really adequate right now. So it almost needs to sort of like take another step back and put slightly more planes on the table. Is kind of my gut feeling. But that's this week. I don't know. That might change.
I noticed upstairs has got a bucket load of new aircraft.
Yes, we have got a lot of new stuff that's converting from metal into resin, and that's going to be keeping us going for a long time. I haven't missed you, sir. Go at the hat.
Have you ever had a sort of writer's block where you couldn't get a part of a game
Many times. Usually, if you can't get a bit of the game to work, you can't get a mechanic to work, the reality is you need to cut the mechanic. You need to get rid of it entirely and do something different. I mean, maybe something different that still fulfills what that mechanic was attempting to do in the first place. But usually if you're feeling blocked on a mechanic and it's just not doing what you think it should do, it's best to just rip it out. You can always put it back later if you feel like you're definitely missing it. But the first step is to take it away and go, do I miss it? Because 9 times out of 10, you know, a game is a mechanical construct of many different moving parts and so on. A lot less of them are essential than you think they are. So again, take it from somebody who's been writing games for 30 years. There is not a game alive that doesn't benefit from taking 30% of the detail out of it. Because we're always in a compromised position where we're trying to create that consensual reality of what we think is truth, trutheism, but also make things slick and mechanically simple and easy to pick up on. You tend to get fooled into thinking you need a lot of factors taken into account to create that consensual reality. You don't really, because it comes from the players themselves. How can I explain this better? It goes back to what I was saying about the 2000 AD games. There's all sorts of things that I pull mechanically in the 2000 AD games that I wouldn't dream of doing normally. I could do those because I can point to the comics and say, but if you read Prog 248, you'll see exactly that kind of thing happens. So there isn't, that consensual reality is a lot more broad-based, it's a lot more wacky. And the mechanics you use to achieve that, I say, you don't need as many of them. When you're starting out, you tend to overcomplicate everything. More granularity, more factors being taken into account makes it feel like it's more truthful and real. But actually, part of your job as games designer is to take those many factors and take them off your player's plate. Render them down, make them simpler, make them more direct, make them more meaningful. Because the world's worst mechanic is one that's complicated, hard to enact, and actually has very, very little impact on the game. Even a bad mechanic, a great example of a bad mechanic is back in Warhammer. Back in Warhammer, when they had the rout mechanic, when if you routed, it might panic other units nearby. And that's not necessarily a terrible mechanic in itself, but it didn't stop there. No, those units, if they broke, could then break the units next to them, and so on down the line. That's a terrible mechanic. That my personal experience, it led to games where, you know, the terror-causing undead dragon lands in front of your forces, and your entire army breaks and runs off the table because it's turn 1, so they're right on the table edge. Terrible mechanic, but memorable. So memorable. I remember, you know, decades later, I remember that instance with anger and bitterness, admittedly, but it was funny, and we did just restart because, hey, it was the start of the game. So that was a terrible mechanic, but it was a memorable mechanic at the same time. If your mechanics are going to be either terrible or memorable, try and make them memorable. Terribly memorable is I guess what I'll say on that front. But as a rule of thumb, you know, that round mechanic, it was the cascading point that made it capable of going offhand. There was another virus grenade thing in 40k, very similar, could get really out of hand. Bad, but memorable. So if you're going to have bad mechanics, make them memorable. If they're not even memorable, just cut them out and try and do without, because your game will be better for it in the long run. You so again.
As a games designer, do you find it hard not to put your own house rules on existing games?
Like other people's games?
Yeah, and my second question is, out of your own games, which do you play the most?
First things first. House ruling other people's games, I try not to, actually, as a rule of thumb. Partially out of a professional courtesy, if you will. Partially because I want to see what they were trying to do in the first place. It's very easy to sort of like knee-jerk a little bit based on your first game or two or something, your first experience of it, and go, well, you know, clearly that should be +3 and not +1. But actually, you need to give it a little bit of time and see and let it settle in and go, well, actually, is that right or is that wrong? I've got no problem with people house ruling things. I think it's a really good idea as a rule of thumb. Players are different, their expectations are different, the amount of time they have to play is different, their forces are different, their terrain choices are different. So for different households, different choices, house rules make a lot of sense. For me as a designer, I kind of need to see how it's supposed to work before I start diddling with it. And if I'm honest, I don't generally play many systems enough to get to the point where I should start house ruling it to make it comfortable for me to play, you know, with my friends, in my environment, with my terrain, with my playing pieces, my model collection, whatever it may happen to be. So yeah, I don't tend to. House rules is for you, the players, to come up with, because it's all about customizing things to make your experience what you want it to be. And while the role of the games designer is to say, this is the way you should play your game, it's only should, it's not must. I'm trying to show a good way of doing it. If you feel that you can see a better way of doing it, you know, within those parameters, with who you play with and the kind of game you want to play, absolutely go for it, more power to you. That is how you start out being a games designer, is by mucking around with other people's games. That's how I started out when I was like 12 years old. And there's nothing negative about that. But as a games designer, I want to see what the games designer was aiming for first, before I sort of like surrender to my own ego about changing their game. As to what I play the most, it's usually whatever I'm working on at the time. Right now, I am working on something with Gav that's not for Warlord, and we've been playing a fair bit of that. Blood Red Skies is something I play a fair bit of. But if I'm honest, tabletop gaming, it's too much of a profession for me now to really pursue as a hobby, which is a sad transition that happened at some point in the last 20 years, basically. Although, it must be said, one of the things I've been finding about this project I'm working on with Gav is that as part of that, we've been trying to develop new miniatures and so on, and 3D printing them as like test pieces. And I have found myself converting the miniatures and painting them up and stuff like that, which, I don't know, it's funny, it's scratched an itch that I've not really scratched since I was at Games Workshop up till 2004, because it was so much of my job there was like converting armies, painting up armies, coming up with stuff in a very kind of physical, hands-on way. And it's been really good. It's been really nice to do that. Kind of like reacquainted me with a part of my hobby that I haven't done for a long time. Traveling to the US and stuff like that just killed it for me. Because there's a lot of stuff that's associated with your hobby that you have to drag around intercontinental moves, and it proves it's not too easy to get it all back out again and then move again and then get it out again and then move again. Anyway, so yes. Any more questions? How are we doing on battery power?
Time for one more.
Time for one more. One more question. You, sir.
As you've released loads of games over the years, what's your biggest surprise after a game's been released that you didn't expect somebody to do? Or
What, somebody else to do?
yeah, taking the rules you've written and stuff, what's your biggest surprise that you may not have thought of or happened unexpectedly?
Not quite what you're asking, but I'll tell you that my genuine biggest surprise over my 30-year career is that people still like and play Gorka Morka. And I don't mean a little bit, actually. They really like it. They really like it.
Do you think is it not? I've never played it, but is it what surprises you about it?
I think it's a personal experience thing for me, because Gorka Morka was this hell project that was dropped on our heads at like the 11th hour, because we did Necromunda the year before, which had been very popular, and people really liked it. And at that time, Games Workshop Studio was going through doing 2 big box games a year was the plan. So one of them would be like Epic or Warhammer or 40k, and the other one would be something else. So we'd done Blood Bowl, we'd done Necromunda, and it was coming up on what the something else would be for that next year, sort of thing, because I think it was going to be Warhammer in the later part of the year. And so time went by and time went by and time went by and time went by, and eventually Rick Pierce came down and said, we're going to do this thing called Gorka Morka with orcs. It's like Mad Max with orcs, which is fine. I've got nothing particularly against that. The problem with it was that he told me this in April? No, January. and we had to ship it by April. So I had to write the rule book in 8 weeks, which I did by basically locking myself in a box with the Necromunda rule book and like sawing all of the things that said Necromunda off it and putting Orc on instead. And all the bionics and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, it was just a mad dash of a project for me. So I kind of hated it on that level. I say not because of the content, it was fun. It was kind of fun and funny, but the work schedule that I had to do to get it out there was just like nightmarish. And because of that, I always assumed I must have done a fairly poor job because I didn't have much time for testing or anything. I was literally taking stuff whole hard out of Necromunda and like knocking it about, changing it to orcs and grots, changing the weapons over to sluggers and shooters and all this sort of thing, like this, fast as I could for the entire period. So I didn't have an awful lot of faith in the game itself. I had a lot of faith in Necromunda, with it, which it was based on, but this was with vehicles and driving around and all this sort of stuff, which Rick had tested out the ideas for vehicles and so on. He said it was all right, but I didn't have an awful lot of faith in it. And it went out there, and it did kind of all right, but specialist games at the time, you know, they stayed around for about 7 months, and then they went away again. It was more about having them in the store than it was about having an extra hobby range that would stay forever. So it kind of went away again, and decades later I find out the fact that people have got like, you know, collecting groups for Necromunda, for Gorka Morka, and they're still playing it now, and they're writing supplements for themselves and all this sort of stuff. And it's like Battlefleet Gothic, which I've been proud of, and that was my proudest moment really at Games Workshop, was producing Battlefleet Gothic. That I could understand, and I was really kind of pleased and proud to see that decades later, people are still playing the game. They're still, you know, 3D printing their ships and stuff now. Wow, it's actually having something of a resurgence. To find the same thing had happened to Gorka Morka was nothing short of like just amazing. I was like, really? Gorka Morka? That thing? But yeah, people still fondly remember it to this day and do indeed enjoy it and go, why do you hate us so much, Andy? And it's like, it's nothing to do with the game. It was the circumstances I had to write it under, really. And if you see Rick today, you can blame him for that. It was all his fault.
Related to that, we play Necromunda, which combines the two rule sets.
Makes perfect sense. They are brothers. They are literal brothers, you know, born together. So, yeah, it's like people talking about playing Inquisimunda, where they play Inquisitor but with Necromunda rules, and so it's like it's really nice to see. That's the kind of cross-pollination and kind of house ruling I've got a lot of time for. It's like, yeah, absolutely, take this game and apply it to something else. No problem with that. All right, I think that's all we have time for.
Yes. I think a round of applause, please.